Paris. I'm visiting this semester here at the iSchool. I'm sorry, the dean is very sorry that she could not be here for this particular event. Sends her regrets, but it does allow me to say some things about Rebecca that aren't on her official resume.
Oh, no.
To simply state it, Rebecca's many accomplishments, her powerful and long-standing advocacy on behalf of global internet freedom, her thoughtful and often provocative writings, her founding of the Citizen Media Network, Global Voices, of Ranking Digital Rights, a co-founder of the Global Network Initiative. So much more speaks to a passion and a purpose that I will say to the students in the room, I hope you find in your life. She is an unorthodox and highly creative thinker. She's also an energetic and effective doer, and it is rare to find both in one person. She brings together the academy and the street. She is fearless. She is outspoken. She speaks truth to power, and then power often invites her out to lunch. So I think after she speaks, you may want to do the same. And she is my friend and long-term colleague and co-conspirator, Rebecca MacKinnon.
I've got one of these. I have one of these, so and here's your. Wow, well, that was quite an introduction. Thank you, Leslie. Leslie didn't introduce herself, but Google her, and you will be very impressed. Just put it that way. No, Leslie has been a real leader and a pioneer in this space and in dealing with these issues, and has been a real inspiration to me as well. We'll just leave it at that for now. Hopefully I'm speaking loud enough for the room. I'm afraid I've got a cold. I'm a little congested, so. I'm sorry? A little louder? Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit congested, so I'm not as loud as I might normally be. So if I get too quiet, please let me know. So I'm here to talk in a broad kind of overview about power, accountability, and human rights in a networked world. And sort of as I get further in the talk, I'll talk about some more specific things. But I think that we have a fairly diverse audience here today. And so it makes sense to frame some of the broader issues. Now, we've just hit the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring, when the dictatorship in Tunisia, the dictator of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, all fell due to popular movements in which the internet played a meaningful role. There's a lot of debate about exactly the extent to which the internet caused or brought about these events. But at the time, Wael Ghonim, an Egyptian activist by night, Google executive by day, who actually did some time himself for his role in the protests, shortly after Mubarak fell, he said to CNN, if you want to liberate a society, just give them the internet. Now, it's very true. He was the administrator of a Facebook page called We Are Khaled Saeed. It started out as an anti-torture Facebook page in memory of a young man who was beaten to death by police. And that Facebook page actually was the genesis of a lot of the early protests that then led to the Tahrir Square protests. And so, you know, there were some interesting Twitter memes about, you know, while Khaled Saeed, his ghost kind of helped to bring Mubarak down, and kind of the internet-driven movement around that. However, Another activist I know, Alaa Abdel Fattah, is in jail and hasn't been in jail for some time. And if you read the human rights reports about what's going on in Egypt today, you'll see that it wasn't so easy as bring the internet to Egypt and the dictator falls and democracy comes and end of story. There are actually a lot more complicated issues at play that relate to on-the-ground politics, that relate to all kinds of socioeconomic issues, military issues, and so on. So there, you know, there's been some kind of bloom off the rose in terms of excitement about the democratizing role of the internet and the ability to use the internet to push for human rights, to push for accountability. And in the other country that saw a revolution in the Arab Spring, in Tunisia, which so far has had a somewhat happier story in that there is still an experiment at democracy in play. There are a lot of debates going on, and this gentleman who, Riyad Gherfali, who I also know, who played a role in a lot of online activism, kind of making fun of Ben Ali, the dictator, and kind of anti-censorship protests and so on, prior to the Arab Spring protests. He made a comment that I thought was really apt, because before the revolution, everybody was against censorship, or everybody who was against the dictator was against censorship, and everybody who was for democracy was against surveillance, and it was very black and white. And so he liked to say, before things were simple, you had the good guys on one side and the bad guys on the other. But now in Tunisia, people are fighting about what kind of censorship in a democracy is appropriate when you have the Islamic State as a threat within that society. What kind of surveillance is appropriate for law enforcement and anti-terror? And nobody agrees, and it's a fierce argument. What amount of surveillance is appropriate or censorship is appropriate for child protection, and what is not? There are fierce debates and divides within a much more democratic society than they had, and people are realizing it's no longer so simple as being for or against censorship and for and against the dictator. And so kind of welcome to the democratic world. And we've now just passed the one-year anniversary of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, and of course we had even the further attacks in Paris this fall, the San Bernardino attacks. And this has prompted calls by many democratic leaders. This is Francois Hollande speaking shortly after the first Charlie Hebdo attacks about the need for security. If we're going to protect our liberty, we're going to protect our prosperity, we need security. We need to go after the terrorists not only offline but online. There have been a number of proposals in Europe and elsewhere to hold internet companies responsible for what their users are doing, and hold internet companies legally responsible for any use of their networks by people who may be terrorists or are suspected of being terrorists. And so a great deal of debate. This is sort of a critique by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, headquartered here in San Francisco, about the appropriateness of these laws. And again, it's not that anybody's saying that you shouldn't fight terror, but how do you find the appropriate approach without basically telling internet companies that they have to censor and monitor their users and have full responsibility for preventing the use of their networks by terrorists. The kind of legal term for holding companies responsible is intermediary liability. Leslie knows all about that. But to put it in terms that I think people may remember, you may recall that in 2012, Wikipedia went dark for a few days, and this was to protest something called the Stop Online Piracy Act, which was basically a bill in Congress that was really instigated by the entertainment industry and a number of other industries that are concerned about the erosion of their copyright and their intellectual property on the internet, who wanted internet companies to be held legally responsible for copyright infringement committed by users. And so there was a big fight about that, and it was stopped in Congress. But when you get to the same kind of legal liabilities, but not for copyright, but for terrorism, you know, to fight terrorism, it gets much more complicated and much harder to have a black and white fight over. And so we are, of course, seeing a lot of debates going on now in Washington about what the appropriate role should be for Silicon Valley companies, and I'll talk about that a bit more specifically because there's been news just the past few days about that. But a real debate about to what extent companies should be held responsible for policing what their users are doing and what the relationship with government should be. And part of the problem here is we haven't kind of worked out how we handle the new power arrangements in the digital age, or the new kind of power dynamics of the internet age. And really what's happening now is that the relationship between people, citizens, and their governments is increasingly mediated through the internet, mobile networks, network devices. And so how governments regulate or otherwise exert power on the way in which those networks operate, what they can and cannot do, what they let their users do or not do, what they share, affects, of course, our rights. And also what the companies choose to do in terms of their design and engineering decisions about how you can use their networks or how you can use the devices, what's collected, what's not collected, what's shared, what's not shared, with whom, et cetera, what you can access, what you can't access, under what conditions. This is shaping our relationship with ourselves, with each other, shaping our ability to be educated, shaping our politics, shaping our public discourse. Both of these factors, both kind of governments and politics. And so the issue is, and I'm going out on a limb here and assuming that not too many people in the room have read my book. Am I right? Okay, good. So this will be new for you. So in my book, Consent of the Network, I cite a friend of mine, a journalism scholar, Rosenthal Alves, who talks about the way in which the information ecosystem has changed. And the way he likes to put it is that before the internet, we lived in an information desert. So our legal norms, our economy around information was based on scarcity. It was based on scarcity of information. It was based on information that could be pretty easily controlled, that was expensive to move around and produce, et cetera. The problem is that the rains have come, and we now live in an information rainforest where we have overabundance of information, new creatures emerging all the time, everywhere, and our legal, economic, governance systems are still kind of set up for the desert and not set up for this rainforest. And so therefore we're facing a lot of challenges. It's like, how do we apply a legal system that dealt with a very different type of information environment, very different types of information vehicles, and apply that to security situations, to all kinds of other situations, law enforcement situations, commercial situations that are actually very different, and where the dynamics are very different, and where the volume of things and the pace of things is very different. And we haven't worked out what that structure, how you hold a power accountable in the rainforest when you have so many different types of entities exerting power, exercising power through technology, and how you make sure that the power is not abused. We do not have clear structures for that. one of the reasons why I wrote a book a few years ago was that I was concerned about a certain romanticism about the internet that was sort of reflected in the comment by Wael Ghonim of Egypt earlier in my talk, where there's been kind of an assumption, I think, in the media, amongst policymakers, and so on, that, you have authoritarian countries over there and democracies over there, and inevitably and inexorably, thanks to sort of some combination of capitalism and technology and the internet, the authoritarian countries are going to move over there, and that everything's going to get freer over time. And that's just sort of an inevitable, inexorable thing. I disagree. I don't think you can count on that. Even though you're a well-meaning government or well-meaning company or well-meaning organization, and you can't just assume that things are going to turn out okay, no matter what kind of legal construct you apply on technology to solve a very specific problem. Because if we're not thinking more broadly, what's going to happen is we're going to all meet in the middle. That thanks to technology, countries that used to be totally shut off can't be completely shut off. They still become, there's more discourse in countries like China than before, yet at the same time, they're not democratic. At the same time, there's still a great deal of manipulation. There cannot be dissent. Human rights lawyers go to jail, journalists go to jail, you end up having sort of authoritarian countries kind of being a little more pluralistic but not democratic, and democratic countries sort of meeting in the middle. And this is what I'm really worried about. If you look at the trends, Freedom House, which is a human rights organization based in Washington, D.C., produces an annual index where they evaluate, they apply a whole bunch of different indicators across many countries across the world, not all, but all the ones that you see in color. And they've been looking specifically at levels of internet freedom and openness across the world for the past 5 years. And they found a steady decline in the levels of freedom and openness, including privacy, including the ability of journalists to operate online, et cetera, including laws that are increasingly holding companies accountable for what their users do and requiring companies to hand over more and more data about users, to censor more and more user content, et cetera. The World Wide Web Foundation also, for a few years, was putting out what they call the Web Index. They didn't put it out last year, so this is for the previous year, but it still, I think, has a lot of data that is, shows some trends, I think, that are useful to think about. They found that they looked at 86 countries, and of the 86 countries, 62% of them kind of demonstrate that the web and the internet play a major role in sparking social or political action. So in other words, the internet is an important thing that people are relying on for journalism, for advocacy, for their religious life, for their civic life in much of the world, in a large chunk of the world. Yet, there are a lot of troubling trends. So for instance, 84% of countries do not have effective laws and practices to protect the privacy of online communications. So, everybody's dependent on these networks, but our rights are very clearly not being protected, either sort of commercially or politically on them, and that is a problem. It's been 2.5 years now since Edward Snowden came out with his famous revelations about NSA surveillance. I'm assuming everyone in the room doesn't need an introduction to the basic content of his revelations. But of course, while the NSA is certainly an issue, As the UN Human Rights Commissioner has pointed out, surveillance is an epidemic problem all over the world. And they're particularly mass surveillance. So, a targeted surveillance would be when the government says we have a warrant, or we have a particular case and we want information about a particular person, or we want to look at a specific thing. Whereas mass surveillance is like, we just want to sit on your network and gather everything that's coming across because we need to, or gather sort of a whole chunk of communications because we need to just capture whatever we might need. And, to put it very simply, that's what mass surveillance is. And there's concern that's been voiced throughout the human rights system that mass surveillance is not consistent with international human rights standards, with international human rights law. We have surveillance bills in the United Kingdom, in other parts of Europe, not to mention across other parts of the world that are increasingly basically requiring companies to allow governments to just access everything going across their networks. Now, there's been a coalition of activist groups, academics, human rights organizations that have put together something, and legal scholars that have put together something called the Necessary and Proportionate Principles. And the point, and you can go onto their website, necessaryandproportionate.org. You can look at it, you can look at all the legal background behind it. But the point is here is that, yes, we do need some surveillance. The point is, okay, we're not saying no surveillance. We're saying that if you're going to do surveillance for law enforcement, national security, other purposes that are arguably legitimate and necessary, international human rights law is in the context that, security is a necessary thing. But the surveillance needs to be done in a particular context that's consistent with human rights law. And so they have these 13 principles that, of course, have a lot more text behind them on the website explaining where the international law comes from. It needs to be, it needs to be grounded in law. There needs to be a legitimate aim. It needs to be proportional to the alleged crime. There needs to be due process. There needs to be transparency about what is going on. There needs to be public oversight, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, on the freedom of expression side, a group of civil liberties organizations and legal scholars have put together another thing called the Manila Principles, which is conveniently at manilaprinciples.org, which is around what I was talking about earlier, intermediary liability. So the point being is that, okay, there are legal constraints that companies are put under, but laws regulating companies need to be in a particular context in order to prevent a situation where the law is compelling companies to violate users' rights. And so this is the context in which the laws need to be set up. So there's been sort of a bunch of work done about, basically how governments could set up their regulatory and surveillance frameworks and so on to be much more compatible with international human rights law than they currently are. And there's certainly been international outcry. This is a meeting that happened in Brazil a year or so ago after the president of Brazil got very angry about the NSA's tapping of her phone. So there's sort of a number of world leaders decided there needed to be this international meeting to, kind of come together and declare basic principles for how the internet should be governed. There was a lot of good I think, rhetoric coming out of the meeting about, you know, we commit to a free and open internet, and we commit to respect the rights of internet users, but many of the governments there, I should say most, are not really exactly living up to what they say. There's also something called the Freedom Online Coalition that the US government is part of, that Hillary Clinton was part of kind of forming as part of her internet freedom policy when she was Secretary of State, that a number of democracies have joined. They all make commitments. You can go on the website and see the commitments that these governments have made to promote a free and open internet. This thing was set up before the Snowden revelations, and sort of ever since the Snowden revelations, there's been a real question about, you know, actually, if you look at what these governments are doing, they're taking things in the wrong direction, even in the democratic world. You know, which brings us to the non-democratic world. I highly recommend, if you want to kind of follow issues kind of beyond the US and Europe, which the international, you know, kind of the US and sort of the Guardian and so on, US press, British press, you know, kind of cover the US and Europe, but if you want to know what's happening beyond that, I recommend Global Voices Advocacy. There's a URL that's just advox.globalvoicesonline.org. I'll show you the URL at the end of my talk as well. But they put out something every week called the Netizen Report, where they're kind of doing a survey of all the different things happening in the world that are affecting internet users' rights. And every week, it's, you know, there's this law that got passed, there are these people who are getting arrested, et cetera, et cetera. And the trends are very clearly not good around the world. And when you look at a lot of these reports, you see governments from Cambodia to Turkey to, you know, all over the world, invoking rhetoric that's come from the United States, invoking, you know, national security rhetoric, invoking rhetoric coming out of the UK about the need for surveillance online and to catch terrorism, rhetoric coming out about cybercrime, cybersecurity, and you see, you know, the spring of cybercrime laws is this headline here, but what's important to understand is that many governments define cybercrime in a very different way than you and I might think about the definition of cybercrime. So in a lot of countries, cybercrime includes any crime committed using the internet. And any crime committed using the internet, well, how do those governments define crime? And many governments define crime to include opposition to the government, right? And increasingly, terrorism is being defined in many countries to include, for instance, journalism. So in Ethiopia, one journalist, there's been a number of journalists jailed. I highly recommend to you this particular article in Vice on February 1st, written about Eskinder Nega. I highlighted something and it is not showing up, which is very annoying, but it's a profile. It starts with a profile of the wife and son of this jailed Ethiopian journalist, Eskinder Nega. He was jailed on terrorism charges because he was doing investigative journalism against the government. And there's a sentence early on in this article that is absolutely chilling. And Nafkat is the name of the 9-year-old son of Eskinder Nega. He doesn't really understand what's going on. He's just reading all kinds of stuff coming off the Ethiopian media and internet. This kid believes that journalists are terrorists. Nafkat Nega, it says underneath there, this highlight got moved somehow. He thinks journalists are terrorists. He thinks his father is a terrorist. He actually believes this. And apparently young people in Ethiopia today largely believe this. And the sentence in this article, how Nafkat came to believe journalism is a crime equivalent to terrorism, is a case study of how governments have used the internet as a tool for repression. So this is where things are getting really quite scary in a lot of countries, that anti-terror and cybercrime laws are just being applied to stop any kind of online activity that the government considers to be enemy activity. And that is problematic. And into that kind of global context, of course, comes the FBI Director James Comey last year, where he, has been calling on Apple and other companies, all the internet companies basically, to dump encryption that makes it impossible for law enforcement to access people's communications. And again, in a perfect world where law enforcement never abuses its power and where we're all very democratic and you can count on the law enforcement just to go after terrorists that are really terrorists, maybe that's okay. But we don't live in that world, right? And that's why it's not okay, and why CEOs like Tim Cook here have been pushing back against these requests to weaken the encryption on phones. You've had other companies. So, for instance, the General Counsel of Microsoft, Brad Smith, called the NSA a advanced persistent threat to its business because it's making it harder for Microsoft to convince customers outside of the United States that the data is secure. And of course, we're seeing, we can talk more about in the Q&A if people want, about sort of the fight going on between the US and Europe about the security of data and surveillance and et cetera. But so companies, what's very interesting is you're seeing that companies' commercial interests and governments' interests are increasingly different in a very interesting way. That plays out in different ways that are sometimes pretty good for human rights, sometimes less so in different contexts. And just to kind of illustrate this sort of global empires that we're seeing emerge with some of the world's biggest internet companies. This is a world map of social networks generated by a guy in Italy. He does it twice a year. It's really interesting to see it over time. In the last couple of years, it's been pretty stable. All of the blue you see on this map are countries where Facebook is the most popular social network. And you see, with the exception, with a couple small exceptions in Iran and Central Asia, and Japan just always being kind of out there on its own for reasons that require somebody else's talk to talk about Japanese culture. You see a big red China, and you see a big orange Russia. Russia, the most popular online network, social network is VKontakte, for reasons that relate to kind of the local business environment. China, it's Qzone, which is owned by Tencent, which is listed on the stock market here. And Facebook can't compete with them because Facebook is blocked. So if you try to access Facebook in China, this is what you get, unless you know how to use fancy technical software known as circumvention software that we can discuss in Q&A if people really want. But the point is that most ordinary internet users without sort of technical knowledge cannot access Facebook, and Facebook doesn't really exist for most people in China. Certainly not in sort of significant, in a significant way. But Facebook has been making different decisions in different markets about its relationship with different governments. So Facebook so far has decided, okay, because the Chinese government has actually told Mark Zuckerberg, you can come to China. You just have to censor a lot of content whenever we ask you to, and take down a bunch of pages and posts and photos and whatnot, whatever we request. And you also have to keep your user data of Chinese users in Chinese jurisdictions so that Chinese police can access it as they need. And so far, Facebook has not acquiesced to this requirement, and so therefore they are blocked. However, Facebook has made different choices in different jurisdictions. So for instance, they are in Russia. They've got sort of a, shall we say, rocky relationship with the Russian government, but they are removing posts. So this is the Facebook page of a Russian activist before it was blocked inside Russia. But now when you try and access it inside Russia, you get an error message that basically says, we're sorry, this page cannot be accessed. And you get that if you're in Russia. You can see it if you're outside of Russia, but not if you're inside of Russia. And so that's kind of the agreement that Facebook has made with the Russian government so that they don't get completely blocked, that they're basically blocking certain pages and certain types of content for Russian users in Russia, but leaving a lot of it, most of it up for people outside of Russia if it's the result of a government request. And other companies are doing this too. So this is a screenshot from YouTube in Pakistan, where Google recently decided to set up a local version of YouTube, and we're going to talk about that more in a panel tomorrow. But this is the error message you get when you try to access the famous Innocence of Muslims video that I think we can assume I don't need to get into the whole history of, but it's considered blasphemous in many Islamic societies, including Pakistan, and the government has told YouTube that they can only be accessible in Pakistan if they make this video inaccessible and a number of other things that the government considers blasphemous. However, human rights groups in Pakistan are concerned that the government is going to increasingly push YouTube to take down more content, and Facebook is blocking things in Pakistan and so on. And so it's definitely, there's reason for people to be worried about the extent to which content is going to end up being blocked to people in Pakistan. Now, these companies I just talked about, Facebook, Google, and a number of other companies, including Microsoft, Yahoo, now LinkedIn, and a few others now, recently some European telecommunications companies have joined as observers, are members of something called the Global Network Initiative, which Leslie here and Bennett Freeman there and I were involved with helping to start, which is an effort to get companies to make some key commitments in how they're going to handle government demands. So when a government asks you to take down content, or block content, when a government asks you to hand over information about users, how do you handle this in a responsible way? Because it's easy to say, okay, companies just should not operate anywhere where there's censorship and surveillance that might violate people's rights. But if you take that approach, basically companies will operate nowhere. Right, so given that reality, given that most governments at sometimes all the time, sometimes occasionally, are making surveillance and censorship decisions and demands that human rights groups strongly disagree with, and that human rights scholars feel is violating rights. What do companies do? How do companies act responsibly? And so part of it is about being transparent, both notifying the user that something has been taken down at government request, like you saw with some of those notifications, but also producing things that are now called transparency reports, where companies are issuing a lot of data about the number of government requests they're getting around the world and the percentage they're actually responding to, so at least people know what's happening, as opposed to companies complying and nobody knowing what's going on. So at least people understand the extent of government demands being placed on companies. They can see the stats about it. And at least in some countries where there is more civil society, more media, people can kind of then push to ask the government, why are you demanding all these things? We need to change the law. So for instance, in India, you've seen a lot of activism around the amount of requests that are coming from the government as revealed by the company transparency reports. And the GNI, the Global Network Initiative, also requires companies to agree to do things like carry out human rights impact assessments, so really kind of evaluate before they go into a market, or whether they're going to stay in a market based on the human rights situation in that market. So, you've seen kind of Google going in and out of China. You've seen some companies decide not to go into China. You've seen other companies going into China in a more kind of limited way, or kind of fencing off certain data and so on. And that's in part because they're trying to assess, okay, how do we engage with this market in a way that's, I mean, one can always debate about, whether a company should engage or not under any circumstance, but, trying to be responsible and transparent and talk to stakeholders about what they're doing and why they're doing it, rather than being secretive about it. So that's kind of with government requests. However, what the Global Network Initiative doesn't deal with so much is companies' own rules. So, this is a copy of Twitter's rules about what, if you use Twitter, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do on Twitter. And if you violate these rules, your account can be suspended or deleted, or you could have your tweets deleted and so on. And this has nothing to do with the government directly. It's just Twitter's own rules. Although governments do kind of tell the companies you need to tighten up your rules. And so we're seeing that a lot in the United States in particular, where because of the First Amendment, the government can't directly tell Twitter to take down content most of the time, but they can say, well, you're not doing enough to tighten up your rules to police terrorism privately. And then Twitter tightens up its rules. And so that's a very interesting dynamic because there's no kind of legal chain of responsibility or accountability. It's Twitter having its rules and enforcing them. Facebook has its community standards. And there's a lot of very legitimate reasons for safety and protecting people against harassment and bullying and child exploitation and all kinds of reasons why you want to have safety, why you want to enable users to report abuse by other users, bad behavior, and so on. But we're also starting to see kind of governments use these mechanisms to get things taken down that actually aren't technically illegal. And so increasingly putting pressure on companies to use their private rules to police things that there's actually no clear law about, or that if a law were passed, it would be really hard to get it passed and there'd be a lot of debate about the definitions. And so you're starting to see a lot of instances, say for instance, in the UK and now across Europe, there's a body that kind of basically sends blacklists to the companies of content they need to take down. And this is not through a legal process. This is sort of an extra legal reporting process. And their definition of terrorism is very broad, and it kind of relates to, basically expressions of dissatisfaction with the government and sort of a list of criteria, and that causes these organizations to report certain things. And so, again, where's the accountability here? And then you just kind of get these messages about, well, this account has been taken down, but you don't know why. And it's been taken down globally, not just in a particular country. So what I've been trying to do, I'll just talk briefly about the project I'm working on to try and basically through research and data, bring to light some of the practices going on by companies and how those practices are influenced by governments or not, and to what extent. Try to push for better practice by companies, but also simultaneously try to highlight where law is preventing companies from doing as well as they could. And so this rankingdigitalrights.org/index 2015, we put out a ranking or an index of 16 companies. This is the first time we've done it, so we started with a fairly limited set of companies, 8 internet companies and 8 telecommunications companies, and here's the full list here. It's a little hard to see, so go to rankingdigitalrights.org and you can kind of go through all the data, and I could spend an entire hour or two going through everything, which I'm not going to do today, obviously, because I want to end the presentation soon and have a discussion. But what's very interesting is, we applied 31 different questions to these companies about, are they conducting human rights impact assessments? Do they have commitments to respect their users' rights, sort of in the commitment section? On freedom of expression, are they clear about what their rules are? Are they transparent about what's getting taken down, on whose authority, how they're enforcing their terms of service, et cetera, et cetera? With privacy, how clear are they about what they're collecting and why and who they're sharing it with, et cetera? the company that did the best, and this is just on transparency, this is just kind of what they're telling you they're doing. So there are some companies that might be doing a little better, but they don't actually communicate it very well. And so we're trying to say, look, if we're going to hold you accountable, you need to actually communicate what you're doing. And let's start there. So Google ended up getting the highest score simply because it puts out as much more information than everybody else. I think if we get better practice, we'll see people surpass Google probably, because there's some very specific practices that a lot of companies are better at Google on. But kind of in aggregate, Google again discloses more things about what it's doing. But they got a D. And most companies failed on most of our criteria in terms of what they're doing, really kind of over 40%, we kind of called that meaningful effort, and under 30% is sort of not very meaningful effort at all. And one of the trends we found, I'm going to talk about this a lot more in our panel tomorrow, is that companies are much more transparent about how they're handling government demands. And all this stuff I was talking about with their own terms of service and kind of informal requests they're getting from governments or sort of think tanks that are aligned with the government, or citizens associations concerned with different things, and what they're taking down, or what they're just taking down of their own volition, or what they're sharing with different entities kind of commercially, but then governments can access for different reasons. All of that is not very transparent. And we need greater accountability in that regard. And this is sort of a map of the internet companies we looked at. We looked at a Chinese company, a Korean company, a Russian company, and then a smattering of telecommunications companies across the world. And what's really interesting is the extent to which, in a lot of countries, the law is just not allowing companies to be transparent about what they're doing without any sort of clear national security reason. It's just that the law is not allowing transparency. Governments are not being transparent at all about the demands they're making on companies. So it's really hard to know who's responsible for what. And if we're gonna deal with abuse, kind of coming back to this broader picture about how do we hold power accountable in this age of information overload and information abundance, of our own information, of everybody else's information, we need to be able to know when abuses are committed, who they're committed by, and the abusers need to be held accountable. And if we're not able to do that, we're not going to have human rights, we're not going to have democracy in the long run on this planet if you can't hold power accountable to at least some baseline degree, and we're losing that. So just to wrap up, I've just painted a somewhat distressing picture, but I just want to say that this would be a great time to be a student, because, well, yeah, because we're tired, we've been fighting for a while, but you guys are really going to shape where this is going to go. You guys are going to figure this out. And we have a work of it, fixing all of this, figuring out what's the new kind of, what are the accountability structures to hold power accountable across different jurisdictions, across corporate networks, when sometimes regulation is protecting privacy and sometimes is violating it, all in the same country or across the same region or across the world. How do you deal with the fact that a law passed in the UK is going to have an impact on internet users in Egypt because the Egyptian government's going to copy it in a very different situation, and the legislators in the UK have no accountability to people in Egypt, and right, because they're just answering to people in the UK. So how you deal with power and accountability in this network world, this is the work of a generation to really figure out. I just, for starters, we have to do a lot of legislative reform all over the world. And we need to really be looking at treaties and regulation at national, regional level in a more holistic manner, and what's its impact on the global network and on the human rights of users everywhere. How do we hold companies accountable in a genuine way across global networks. That's the piece I've been working on, and tomorrow in our panel with Leslie and Bennett and others, we're going to spend a whole panel talking about that. Demanding transparency. How do we get governments and companies to be more transparent about how power is being exercised over our speech and over information about us? Building movements. Ensuring technologies are compatible with human rights, right? So this whole encryption debate, for those of you who are technologists, computer scientists, how do we think about when we're, building a device or coding a program, how this is going to be used for good and for ill and in all kinds of contexts, and how do we make sure that we're really maximizing kind of the rights and freedoms of people using this. And insisting on public participation in technology's future, and which means that you want people to be able to have community networks, you want people to be able to create their own media, you want grassroots involvement in technologies, so that the open source movement, et cetera, et cetera. We need to make sure that innovation is not concentrated only in sort of big government, big corporate entities, to make sure that technology is really going in a direction that doesn't just serve the most powerful and the most mainstream. One final observation, because I think when you hear a talk like mine and you're a student, you might think, gee, I guess Rebecca must think that I have to go work for a human rights organization and there's no other, honorable path for me. And, what about paying off my loans or, whatever it is. And I just want to say, actually, we need passionate people in all parts of society, in all sectors. And one of the things I've observed in my work internationally and in the United States is that when change happens or when something bad is stopped, it's not just because the human rights groups, as we like to call civil society, the civil liberties groups, the human rights lawyers were yelling and screaming about. That helps, that's part of the piece that all the activists get activized, right? So you need that. But generally, if those are the only people doing stuff on a particular issue, it doesn't succeed. The change doesn't succeed or the bad thing isn't stopped. Where the change happens is when you get sort of an overlap of interests and efforts between civil society, some segment of the corporate sector, and some part of government. There's some group of politicians decide it's in their interest to align themselves with this issue. Some set of companies see it's in their interest. So for instance, on some of the national security debates recently, the debates about whether companies should be forced to destroy their encryption, you've got companies and civil liberties groups and some people in Congress have all come together to push back against that. And they've made some headway. It's hard, but they've made headway. And the only reason they've made headway is not just because the civil liberties groups were making good arguments, it's because there was a real alliance there. And similarly with other issues in other countries, anytime I've seen actual progress or something bad stopped, it's because there was an alignment. Or whether or not you agree with it, say take India recently, there was this internet.org where Facebook was trying to, I won't get too far into the issue, but Facebook was trying to roll out something, yeah, exactly. Facebook was trying to roll out something called Free Basics that kind of gives you a free access to the digital, mobile data, but only to certain services, including Facebook, kind of chosen by Facebook. I'm oversimplifying. But this is available in a lot of developing countries. There was a movement kind of against this. But it wasn't just because the activists were against it, it's because there were parts of industry that were against it, there were parts of government that kind of all came together. And there have been a bunch of other issues in India around digital rights that have been kind of much harder to get progress on, and in part because I think the main reason is you don't have the same alliance of interest going on. And for instance, you can sort of apply that formula in a lot of countries where you see progress or not progress. And where is industry, or where are parts of industry? Where are there any politicians or any parts of the bureaucracy that are with you? So the point is that we need good people in government. We need good people in industry. We need good people in academia and civil society. So whatever path you choose, you have a role to play in this. And I just want to say, finally, there's a few links here. rankingdigitalrights.org is the project I was talking about. advox.globalvoices.org is the Netizen Report, runs on that. Consent of the Network is my book that came out in 2012 with a revised version in 2013 that deals with a lot of these issues. But we're in a really, the next couple of decades are going to be really hard. There's some really tough fights. The national security threats are real. The terrorist threats are real. But the threats to freedom of expression, the threats to democracy, the threats to human rights are equally grave. And I would say all governments right now, I mean, there are obviously some governments that are just using the fight on terror and the need to fight crime as an excuse to call everybody a terrorist and call everybody a criminal. But even the governments that represent the oldest democracies on earth are not getting this right. We need innovation. We're far from having it. And I think many of the people in the room can hopefully play a part in pushing us forward. So with that, I will stop and take questions.
So thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca, go back one slide, and then I'm going to
That one.
I would add something. I've got my students in the room.
Good.
Companies and civil society, put a overlapping something for technical skills brought to the service
Absolutely.
of these debates. Whether you wind up in the public policy sphere as a technologist or you're in a company, if you go back and go look at the reports that have been written about the encryption debate, or what's turned it. It's been the technical understanding of building a backdoor and the cybersecurity threats. And advocates can talk about human rights forever, but it's the prominent technologists speaking up. So change your slide.
Go back here.
No, I'm just saying, change that slide.
Change that slide and add that vector.
Add that vector,
Absolutely.
because I actually think that has been, at least, I don't know when that's going to start getting out of Western democracies, but that has been the secret sauce in
Absolutely.
a lot of the debates over the last
and
5
it's
to
kind
10
of
years.
the technical knowledge going both into
politicians. And some of those people have come out of the
politicians
eye
and civil
school, so I
society.
want to sort of mention and acknowledge that.
That's absolutely important.
Questions? Do we have questions?
When you ask your question, can you please hold the microphone?
I get to hand this off.
And it's for the...
One, two, three. Okay.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I heard this morning about one particular controversy, that is involving Apple and the San Bernardino crimes, where evidently Apple has hold of the DC mobile telephone that belonged to the husband of that couple that perpetrated those crimes, and is refusing to help the FBI unlock the mobile telephone. For one thing, they say they haven't got the software. But I just wonder where you stand on that particular issue.
Yeah, so, this is rough. And apparently, from looking at what Apple's been saying, they have been cooperating with the FBI up until, a judge said you have to basically install a bug on your own system that breaks the encryption, essentially, for this phone, on the system of this phone. And so that the communications can be accessed. And the argument being made by the government is like, look, this is a horrible terrorist situation. We need to pursue it to the fullest. You're obstructing our ability to pursue this. Apple's position is that if we take this step, you're saying it's just this one phone, it's just this once, but this is the beginning of we're going to be asked for this for all kinds of stuff, and not just by the US government. If we show that we can do it for the FBI, then we're going to have to do it for the French government, but we're also going to have to do it for, you know, the government of any market where we have a significant presence. Because otherwise they'll just say, well, we know you can do it, we won't let you in our market, you know, and so particularly, you know, you're a China scholar, so, you know, the Chinese government, just to, again, pick on China perhaps, would say, we know you have the technical capability to do this. You know, we have perfectly good Chinese companies that compete with you. The Chinese people don't need you as much as you need us. So either you do this or you leave China. You know, the Chinese government could say that. And there have been a lot of companies that, when faced with that kind of demand, have not stood on principle. And so I think Apple's realizing that they're kind of at a point, at a juncture, where if they agree to this, you know, the problem is that the technology isn't limited just to democracies where there's a certain amount of accountability, and even we argue about it, but the technology then will be forced to be applied around the world. And so, frankly, I'm standing with Apple because I don't have enough, you know, obviously, if we provide governments with all the possible tools they could have, you know, they can fight crime even better, right? But, you know, there's a reason why police can't just randomly wander into our house, even though that would help fight crime. There's a reason why we have constraints that actually do hinder law enforcement and have always hindered law enforcement and will continue to hinder law enforcement, but we have these constraints for a reason. Because of the kind of society we are and because of what it is we're trying to protect in the first place. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, I've been to North Korea, I was in China in the 70s, you know, I know about, you know, you could stick your wallet on a counter, on a lunch counter somewhere and come back 5 hours later and it would still be there because people were so afraid. And yeah, you know, you kind of eliminate crime when you maximize fear and when you maximize law enforcement access, but there's a line that you don't want to cross if you want to be a society in which rights are protected. And I think that's where the line is.
I've got a lot of questions, so I'm gonna
Sure.
go on. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but we have a hard cutoff.
One very quick question I could ask. Couldn't the decision be limited just to that particular case where?
No. I don't think it can be because all governments in the world are watching this case. And so when they see that Apple has the technical ability to do this, they have the power to compel companies to do it because the technical ability clearly exists, and that companies are willing to do it for one government, then it's, you know, we've seen this with a lot of other surveillance and censorship technologies as well that have become more and more widespread.
It's yours.
What is your take on the Facebook free basics?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Facebook free basics, you know, it's a tough issue in some ways because, you know, there are a lot of markets around the world where people don't have a lot of internet access. And so, you know, basically the way it works is that Facebook does a deal with a cell phone provider, and the cell phone provider provides Facebook and a few other services for free, so you're not paying on a per megabit rate, but if you go to other websites or other services that aren't part of that package, you're paying per megabit. So it's kind of a little walled garden of certain internet services, but not other services, and, you know, Facebook is kind of paying for that. And there's some other companies that do similar types of things. It's known generically as zero rating, and it happens in a lot of places. I think there are some questions about the context in which this kind of thing is deployed. You know, the way in which Facebook went about in India was really tone deaf, and not, you know, not very sensitive to market conditions, cultural issues, all kinds of things. If you're going into a market that's pretty well developed with a lot of competition and so on, perhaps the harm is not so great. But if you're going into a market where there's little competition and people have never used the internet before, so like take Myanmar/Burma, where people are just accessing the internet for the first time, most of the population, via cell phones. In Myanmar, I've not been there recently, but I know a lot of people who've been doing some work there in the technology space, and they say for the average person in Myanmar, the internet is Facebook. Because you go into a phone shop and you buy a phone and they set you up with a 0 rating package, and you get on Facebook and they set up your password, and like people never leave Facebook. And so that's a concern, particularly given that Facebook has a lot of, it enforces its own rules about what your identity can be, in terms of what it's taking down, what it's not taking down. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of concern about journalism being censored on Facebook because it violates the rules, because if you're trying to document violent behavior by a government, then you're violating the terms of service about violent content, and then you can't use it for journalism. And so there are a lot of reasons why being dependent on Facebook as your main conduit for information is problematic. And so, yeah, having kind of Facebook controlling what people know is not a desirable universe.
I do. So I wanted to ask you, a few things that you said made me think and wonder about the polarization of a society and what role that plays. Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned something like, the journalists get labeled as terrorists or as criminals, and the kids believe it. And it occurs to me that that's actually one ingredient that is needed for maybe a government to exert surveillance or exert censorship, or at least with so much impunity. Yeah. In those scenarios. So when there's this adversarial relationship between the government and the people, or between different portions of the civilization, it made me think that this type of relationship could spur greater surveillance and sort of increase this technology. So it ultimately made me wonder if there's a tipping point where societies get stuck. Is there, in other words, a full range of societies that, or possible sort of degrees of abuse and censorship that you've seen in your work, ranging from very democratic to very adversarial? Or do you perceive that there's sort of a gap where past a certain point societies can sort of get stuck sort of in
That's
a
a really good question. I think there's a whole spectrum. And sometimes things look like one thing, but they're really another thing. So you can see, so for instance, I've spent a lot of time looking at the Chinese internet, and so like a lot of Chinese police departments are on social media, and they're talking to people, they're talking to the public a lot, and so then scholars say, hey, that's really democratic, isn't that cool? But then on the other hand, they're like arresting all the human rights lawyers, so that's not so cool. So, it's sort of depending on what you look at, and in different types of societies, actually, you might see quite a lot of debate and discourse going on within certain parameters, so it'll look really free-wheeling, but then as soon as you step outside a particular parameter, things change very quickly, or the fate of the speakers changes quickly. And I think, again, the dynamic really varies depending on, whether you have a fairly homogeneous racial, religious, tribal situation in a country, or whether it's very diverse, whether you have a lot of sectarian strife going on or not, what the gender balance is on the internet, what the education levels are, how much competition there is in the market for telecommunications services. Ethiopia, one of the reasons why Ethiopia is particularly awful is that there's just one telecommunications company. And there's no competition. And the internet is also really expensive. And so there are all these different factors that they all combine somewhat differently in every single country, but you see patterns. So if that answers the question.
Hi, I just wanted to say one thing about the Apple was that I thought there was a technological glitch. I thought about the question for Apple, there was a technological glitch, because they said that as soon as they provide that information, then there could be, if the software ends up in wrong hands,
Right.
it could lock all the telephones. So in fact, they don't have the technology to offer. So I just wanted to say that. And then one question about the ranking digital rights. When you put that list up, it just occurred to me that you might be talking to their PR, and depending on how skilled the PR person is, they would give you the answers that you want, or or they have. It didn't look to me as it wasn't based on evidences. It was based on what they state they do, right? What they say they do, and what if they say and they don't do.
So I encourage you to go on the site. You can actually download all our raw data, and so it would be great if we could kind of go and do technical testing on all of these different networks and really kind of get inside them. We decided to start with what we can. What information, what we can obtain, and what we can measure. We did not talk to the PR people. Actually, a number of the companies we ranked, they wouldn't talk to us at all. And so it was just based on information and data that we were able to collect. And there was a lot of stuff that we collected, because we did talk to some of the companies that wanted to talk to us, we talked to, but there was a lot of information that we evaluated that a number of companies disagreed with us violently about our conclusions. And we were like, I'm sorry, but based on our definition of user data, you're not doing this, that, and the other thing. And they say, yes, we are, here's all the reasons why. We're like, we're sorry, it doesn't fit our criteria. You get a bad score here. Too bad. So, I don't think it's just an evaluation of PR, but, you're certainly welcome, in a very kind of superficial introduction to the project. It's definitely hard to see kind of what exactly it was that we evaluated. And it's certainly just a start. So basically, we're just trying to provide a framework as, here's what companies have committed to do. Here's what they say they're doing. And the next step is for researchers to then take that data and go test it out and verify it. But the problem is you don't even have good comparative data of what they say they're doing at the moment. And so we're trying to kind of just create the first framework on which then a lot more research needs to happen.
So I think we've got one more here. I'm aware of how you're feeling, so would you like to do the last?
Okay, at this point, we don't have too much more time, so.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation. I have two questions. One, what might be the role of the university, for example, University of California, on the civil society? And how would a company or organization become part of ranking digital rights? And I ask this in the context of developing Creative Commons World University and School, like Wikipedia with MIT OpenCourseware, where we hope to offer computer science degrees for the technology side of things, and also even have, if we can, law schools in every country's main language for some of these questions as well.
Cool. So education is vital. And I think Leslie kind of pointed this out earlier, that we need bright people informing policymakers, informing civil society about what is technically possible, not possible. We need people, kind of in all disciplines, kind of working on these questions. And education is the pillar on which all of this, the foundation on which all of this, from which all of this comes. There's a lot of EUC graduates who are doing really amazing work in this space. So I would say the education community is already very involved. With ranking digital rights, I mean, basically we decide which companies to rank. So companies, it's not an opt-in thing. We rank them whether they want to be or not, but they're welcome to talk to us if they feel like it, or not if they don't. But all of our information is open. So our data, our raw data, is published under a Creative Commons license. Our methodology is published under a Creative Commons license. Our reports and analysis are under Creative Commons license, so any educator can use it, for any purpose, or researchers can take our data and do other things with it, or et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, exactly. The mic.
Hi, thank you so much for this. And so my question then, and maybe it'll be good to end on something a little speculative, but thinking about this topic from my familiarity with conversations of global justice, how much does sort of motivation or moral motivation matter for the actors in this space in terms of, so I think of the political philosopher Honora O'Neill, and she has an example of, so a company builds a factory in the United States and it's up to code for United States standards, and then they decide to open a factory in a developing nation, and it's just easier for them to port their designs over. But by doing so, they've elevated the safety standard in that developing country, not for any noble or moral or ethically committed reason, but simply because it was cheaper to import their existing model. So you're in your experience with this, how much does the motivation of the companies or other institutional actors matter? Does it matter that they do the right thing for the right reason, or does it matter that they do the right thing for any reason?
I think the right thing for any reason. You know, I don't really want to be, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's shrink and kind of look inside his heart and get him to do things for the right reason. I just want him to do the right thing for whatever is going to get him to do the right thing. And actually, our friend Bennett Freeman here, who's worked in the business and human rights world and also socially responsible investment world, you know, there's a lot of, there's a whole field that talks about sort of, you know, companies kind of rethinking what's in their commercial interest, going from a very narrow, you know, business for, you know, the business of business is business, and our only obligation is shareholder profit, nothing else matters, to actually sustainability really matters for our business, and what we do for the environment really impacts our ability to do business, to living healthy people in the long run. You know, being good to the communities you're operating in is important for your business in the long, from a commercial, you know, from a profit and loss standpoint, you know, treating, you know, not facilitating human rights abuses in Nigeria, if you're an oil company, will help to prevent sort of, you know, labor stoppages and attacks on your facilities. So, you know, there's lots of reasons why a company should have motivations to do good beyond just it's the moral thing to do. And with the internet, frankly, you know, I think a lot of, you know, in Google, again, like, again, I don't want to be Sergey Brin's psychologist or, you know, Larry Page or certainly not Eric Schmidt's. But, you know, kind of what their motivation is, I think is complicated. But one of the reasons Google has done what it has done, and, you know, they do a lot of controversial things too, but the extent that they've done good, it's in their commercial interest, frankly, to have a free and open internet. It's better for their business. It's much better for their business than to have a walled off, kind of siloed, heavily controlled internet. And so, you know, the extent to which you can find alignment between, you know, the human rights compatible thing and the business interest. And I think, you know, for a long time, people in sustainability and labor and so on have been working with industry to find that sweet spot. And we're only just starting to figure that out with the internet and telecommunications space. But I think, you know, the Global Network Initiative is kind of one of those platforms that's been trying to really establish where that interest lies and where that sweet spot is. We need to expand it to a much broader set of issues and companies.
I think with that, we're probably going to close. There is a panel tomorrow at Barrow at 3 o'clock? Thank you. 3 o'clock that every single, you know, iSchool Center is sponsoring, law school, social science index, that's really going to look more at this question, Anna, which is sort of this question of corporate social responsibility. And I will say this, as sort of having come out of the civil society, there is a piece of civil society who believes if you are collaborating with companies and they're not doing it for your reasons, that you are somehow selling out to evil. And then there are the pragmatists, of which you know, we have a lot of scars for being, which is why I said that she sells truth to power and then they take her to lunch. And I think in the real world, a lot more is achieved. But I can bring in people here who will tell you exactly the opposite. Say what?
Takes both.
Takes
Well,
both.
it does take both, because the pressure comes from there. The aggressive, take no prisoners, unreasonable and hopeful pressure, right? So you just have to decide who you are in that ecosystem when you're trying to change and create. At least that's, I think we both had that experience. So thank you very much. And thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
We never fail